if you have any questions during meeting, please feel free to interrupt. And the logo of TopQuants on the side rotated, so I wanted to imitate that very well. So the story of my of this presentation is that I was given a new assignment, and it was on cash-settled swaptions, and people told me, okay, the market has changed. We can no longer ignore the difference between cash-settled and swap-settled swaptions. Raoul, please go and develop a new model to cope with these with this changed market. And at first I felt this project is really daunting. I basically didn't have a clue. I thought it was daunting for two reasons. The first was that there was no decisive literature out there. And the second was that I knew that we had worked on investigating the difference between cash-settled and swap-settled swaptions before, in 2007. And back then we didn't get very far. We didn't come to an understanding of the mechanics behind these products. Back then the situation was also different. There wasn't a big difference between discounting rates and forecast rates. But now the problem was more pronounced, higher priority, and I thought it was daunting. So I didn't know what to do. I felt like this. But then what do? You simply start and you start to try various things. You go in certain directions that don't lead anywhere. But while you're trying, you sort of come to an understanding, you get a feeling for these products. And at a certain point in time, we were able to formulate a model. And with this model, we got good results. So this presentation is about that journey I went through. Okay, so an outline of the presentation. I split the presentation into 3 parts. The what, the so what, and the now what. And part 1, on the what, I want to explain you what exactly a swaption is, and I want to tell you what has changed in the market. Then in part 2, which is the smallest part, the so what, I want to talk about are these products still relevant, these swaptions? There's so much talk in society about the relevance of this product. I don't want to leave that unmentioned here during a presentation entirely devoted to swaptions. Then I also want to talk about what the impact is of this change in the market. Then part 3, the now what, is a presentation of the new model that we developed. I mentioned we because this actually, while we were embarking on this journey and trying to find a model for this issue, we also created an internship project, and we started looking for candidates, and we found Frank Sengers from VU University, and he joined us, and jointly with him I started working on this topic, and he's here in TopQuants, but he's not at this talk. Because he told me he has enough of cash-settled swaptions. Okay, let's start off fairly simple. I just want to list the key elements in a swaption contract. Obviously, there's the premium. That's the amount of money that a person has to pay to become owner of a swaption. Then that owner, at the expiry date, there's a single expiry date. There he has the right to enter into the underlying. In this case, the underlying is an interest rate swap. And the interest rate swap has a particular period, which we call the tail. So that's the key element of a swaption contract. Also the notional, the amount of money underlying the interest rate swap. You go into the interest rate swap and you end up paying a fixed rate or receiving a fixed rate. and that fixed rate that you pay or receive is called the strike rate. Okay, continuing with what is a swaption. So obviously the word swaption is made up of two parts, swap and option. And it's an option on an interest rate swap, so it gives the owner the right but not the obligation to enter into the underlying swap at the expiry date. And I've depicted the flows coming from this such an interest rate swap here. Now most of you probably already know this, but I just want to go through basic understanding. And what you see here are, we receive in this, if we were to enter into this swap, we would be receiving floating payments, here indexed by Euribor, and the collection of floating payments is called floating leg. And on the reverse side, we pay a fixed rate here, and the collection of fixed payments is called the fixed leg, and the fixed rate, aka strike, is indicated by K. And in this case, we would end up paying the fixed rate, and that means that we would indicate this swaption as a payer swaption. There's also a receiver swaption, and this is always taken from the point of view of who is paying the fixed payments. Okay. Onto the swaption payoff. What you see here is the payoff of a swaption depending on the realized swap rate, which I denote by Y. So this swap rate is a rate which is published by various market data providers, such as Reuters or Bloomberg. Every day you can see there what, say, the 10-year swap rate that they think is that the 10-year swap rate is. So any two market participants will agree on such a swap rate. And if the swap rate ends up, say, for a payer swaption ends up above the strike, then I'd rather exercise the swaption and enter into the corresponding swap where I pay a lower fixed rate than I would end up paying if I enter the swaption in the market. And likewise, if the swap rate ends up below the strike rate, then I'd rather exercise or enter into an interest rate swap in the market rather than exercising my swaption. So there, my swaption payoff will be 0. And then you get a payoff graph that looks like this, and this is exactly the payoff graph of a call option on the swap rate. And likewise, the receiver swaption is a put option on the swap rate. So you see that the payoff is the positive part of the difference between the swap rate and the strike. Now that difference is then paid out at the cash flow dates of the swap. And now then we can start about thinking about the value of this payoff. And for that purpose, it's convenient to introduce a concept called the present value of a basis point, the PVP, also called annuity. And here is the formula for that PVP. It is the sum over the payment dates of the discount factor corresponding to the time of payment. And then these discount factors are then weighted by the year fraction corresponding to the interest rate payment period. And with this PVP or annuity, we can in one go discount all these cash flows and get their value at the expiry date. Okay, so that means that we can write the value of the payoff of a swap-settled swaption as follows. It's PVBP times the positive part of the difference between the swap rate and the strike. And now then that brings me to a position in which I can explain you the difference between swap-settled and cash-settled swaptions. Because in US dollar, in the interbank market, typically banks trade swap-settled swaptions, but in the euro and Great British pound markets, in the interbank market, typically what is executed are cash-settled swaptions. Now, cash-settled swaptions is a swaption where the value of the payoff is settled at the expiry date immediately. And though any two market participants will agree on the realized swap rate, they will certainly not agree on what the value of the PVP is. Remember, this PVP contains discount factors from the whole range of the yield curve, and there are many ways to build a yield curve. So any two market participants will probably disagree. So for that reason, what traders do is they embed into the swaption contract a formula, which is written here. This is the cash-settled annuity formula, where the PVP is replaced with something based on a single interest rate, and the only interest rate that is known to us is the fixing of the swap rate. So say if this is the 10-year swap rate, then this 10-year swap rate is used to form the 1-year discount factor and the 2-year discount factor, and so on and so forth. So we're using the swap rate as a discretely compounded interest rate, and here I've graphed how these discretely compounded discount factors evolve by maturity using a 10% interest rate, which is very unrealistic for today's interest rates, but then at least you can see the compounding effect very well.
Sorry,
yes,
interrupt. I didn't get what's the difference between in terms of the pricing, because the same you said that different counterparties have different discounting curves, different curves from the market.
Yes.
But that the same difference also exists when you have a swap settled, because anyhow you need to value that swap and then discount it, and then you have some.
Yes, but then the value is not exchanged, so they just exchange the cash flows over time. So then once the expiry date occurs, then you enter into the swap, and then you have to wait for a very long time for these cash flows to materialize. Whereas here, at expiry date, you immediately settle the value of the option. So you have to agree on what the value of the PVP is. And in this swaption contract, I mean, it's weird to use one single interest rate to discount all flows. But if you agree on this in the contract up front, and two parties can do that if they want to. And this is actually what happens a lot. And then it's up to the quants, us quants, to correctly value the contracts.
Because that information about the future value of the swap at maturity, is it not reflected in the premium that, I'm talking about the swap settled, the premium that is paid already reflects that information about future value or probabilistic value of the swap at maturity?
Yeah, you would think so, and that is also what we see. But you also see that sometimes it's not reflected, and that the market adjusts. But yeah, you'll see that later on in the talk, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so on to the valuation of these of swaptions in general, but in particular, let's start with the valuation of swap-settled swaptions. And I'll start with the first fundamental theorem of arbitrage-free pricing, which states that the numerical relative value today is the expected value of the numerical relative value at a future date. And in particular, as a future date, I can take the expiry of the swaption, and there the value is simply the payoff of the swaption, and that is what you see written down here. And the payoff, we know, it is the PVP times the positive part of the difference of the swap rate and the strike. And then typically what happens in in swaption valuation is that people assume that the numeraire is the PVP itself. So that it is the swap settled PVP. So I fill that in here. And then what you see is that this PVP term within the expectation cancels out. And you're left with an expected value of something which only depends on the swap rate. And this this expression then, people then, what they typically do is they assume that the swap rate is distributed as either a shifted log normal or a normal random variable, and that leads to the shifted black or the Bachelier formula for the option. And it's quite interesting to see that even though the future payoff depends on the shape of the whole yield curve through the PVP, for the option it doesn't matter what the distribution of this PVP is. What only matters is the volatility of the swap rate. Okay, and then onto the what I would call the cash settled swaption fudge, or the market practice that had been going on up to a few years ago, is that what they did was, here you see this the same reasoning that we saw on the previous slide, but for cash settled swaptions. So the numeric relative value of a cash settled swaption is the expected value of its payoff, and the payoff is now the positive part of the swap rate minus the strike multiplied by the cash settled annuity divided by the swap settled annuity. And now somehow then what people did was they would take a step where they would ignore this ratio and just replace it immediately with the cash settled PVP at time 0. So that is a shady step, but that does yield to a situation in which you can apply the same formula. So you can just apply the black formula, but instead with using the swap settled PVP, you simply fill in the cash settled PVP. And you sort of treat a cash settled swaption as though it is nothing more than a swap settled option. For swap settled swaptions, there is put call parity, so that means that in this fudge there's also put call parity, and that means that cash settled payers and receivers have the same value. And then something changed in the market, and that is what is shown in this slide. So here you see premium values for swaptions quoted by ICAP. ICAP is a global brokerage firm which is specialized, amongst others, in the area of swaptions. And here you see the premiums of particular 20-year expiry, 30-year tail swaptions on 20th of January this year. And you see them against strike. The peak of the graph here is the at the money. And the blue line is what the premiums that they quote at 9 o'clock. And ICAP only quotes out of the money options, which means that below the at the money, they quote cash settled receiver premiums, and above the at the money, they quote cash settled payer premiums. And you see that 9 o'clock, this put call parity still holds, but 10 o'clock, there's a gap. And this is, I suppose, similar to the interest rate swap market moving to multi-curve after the crisis in 2008, when before the crisis, the difference between, say, 3 months interest rate or an overnight index discounting interest rate, you could safely ignore them. But after the crisis, that difference has increased, and you cannot ignore it anymore. And I think this is what was happening here as well.
Excuse me, but
yes,
what's the bit with the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock we have lost something. Why is still holding at 9 o'clock and not at 10 o'clock? Is it,
Why is the what at 9 o'clock?
basically what you said is that at 10 o'clock there is this gap.
Yes.
So what's going on between 9 and 10? That part I'm lost.
So
Can I
yeah.
ask another? It shouldn't hold, the put-call parity shouldn't, do I understand well that the put-call parity shouldn't hold because of the approximation? Is that true?
Because of the approximation, it holds, but the
Yeah, the
approximation.
approximation makes it hold,
Yeah.
but the approximation is wrong. And so it holds by accident at 9 o'clock and not by 10 and not at 10 o'clock. Is that?
Well, this was a permanent change. So if you look at graphs like this before 9th of Jan, they would coincide always, and
Oh.
after 9th of Jan there was a gap.
Oh, that's the trigger point.
Yes, it's like a trigger point.
Because it says 20 Jan, right? Yeah.
Yes, 20th of Jan. Yeah, this year, 2017.
Okay.
So basically, ICAP didn't hold that assumption anymore. So
Yes.
basically, ICAP didn't hold that assumption anymore.
Okay, sure.
So they switched their assumption at 20th of January.
Okay.
And what are the bid-ask spreads there?
Uh,
So I also imagine these are not super liquid things, right?
True.
So it could be the overlap still, right?
Could be. I don't know. But
Because if I don't see the bid-ask spread, it's difficult to judge.
yes,
Because 9 o'clock, I understand this is kind of market is still closed just before opening or at the opening. So the clearing typically gives you kind of everything nice, clean. The market starts, bid and ask liquidity kicks in. So it could be that still there is some kind of bid-ask effect overall.
I think this is larger than the bid-ask effect, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And it's permanent, so it's not like something happened that day. It's well, something did happen. They changed their systems to
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's
that-
what happened in our growth. There was
Yes.
a change, that's what you wanted
Yeah.
to communicate.
Yes.
ICAP changed their models.
yes, ICAP changed their models. Yes, yeah, and this was well. Maybe I should go to. I'll explain this slide in a bit, but I should maybe go to this slide because this information was available since October 2016. So what you see here on this graph are the zero white collar prices. Now the zero white collar is the difference between the payer at the money and the receiver at the money. So the zero white collar is exactly that gap that you see there between the red graph and the green graph. And ICAP started publishing this grid already in October 2016. So the market as such, probably even before October 2016 was taking this into consideration. But just like quoting screens weren't able to show it yet. And what you see here is the price. So this gap, you see it by expiry and by tail. And you see that as the expiry increases and the tail increases, the gap increases as well.
And what is on the z-axis?
The price, but it,
Difference.
yeah, the difference. I wanted to, because this might be I don't know, this is pricing information, so I didn't want to fully disclose levels, but it's quite significant. It's not super significant, but it's quite significant that you want to. We as an institution, ABN AMRO as an institution, wants to incorporate this change that we saw in the market into the valuation of the instruments.
Right. Maybe I can ask a small question. So essentially this means that if you do the pricing, you should use two different types of volatility surfaces.
That could be that is a possibility.
Because I understand that one volatility is not valid anymore in other equation, right? Because they're different products.
Yes, that could be a solution methodology. What I will show in a few slides is a model in which you can go back to a single volatility surface again. So you'd have one underlying volatility model, and then the model will give you the price of the swap settled and the cash settled. So this is the same slide as you saw before as this slide. But now instead of premiums, I'm showing you implied volatilities. So using the market practice cash-settled swaption fudge formula. So you see basically that, well, the same thing. And this brings me to your question, Lev. So imagine you have to set up a trading system to cope with these for swaptions. In the old situation, your trading system would probably assume that the market standard formula fudge holds. So back in that situation, you would only need one volatility curve for both payers and receiver swaptions. That means that, so assuming that your trading system works in that way, then in the new situation, your trading system will probably incorrectly value these swaptions. Because it seems that you need separate volatility curves for payers and receivers. And that is a thing that costs money for banks, and that's why this is important. Okay, so that's the end of part one, the what. Now on to the so what. The question obviously is like, are these swaptions still relevant? These are some newspaper clippings that I found on the internet, and they're in Dutch, but I'll translate. The top one states that swaptions and other weapons of mass destruction, that's from 2012. And this one at the bottom, also from 2012, DNB, the Dutch Central Bank, is asking pension funds that do not fully understand swaptions either to reduce their positions in these products or onboard more knowledge. The middle quote is from the independent committee in the Netherlands, which is advising the banks to how to compensate small and medium enterprises who bought interest rate derivatives. So they wrote a guide on how to do this, and this is the guide that they published on their website. And they're stating that the point of view is that the structured interest rate derivatives, so anything other than an interest rate swap is what they mean here, are not suitable for small and medium enterprises. An exception is when you buy a swaption. So buying a swaption may still be suitable for small and medium enterprises. So obviously, before the crisis, these swaptions were traded much more actively, and after the crisis, they are not traded so much anymore, but they still seem to be traded. Also, I looked at on the websites of the biggest three banks in the Netherlands, Rabobank, ING, and ABN AMRO, and they all have documents on their website explaining what a swaption is and sort of offering it to their customers. So it's more or less public knowledge that the three banks are still offering these swaptions to our customers. So that means that they are relevant. And also, there are still many swaptions from before the crisis on the books. So you need, of banks, so the banks need to correctly value their swaptions. So what is exactly the problem? Here you see again this graph, and in this graph I've depicted the information that the market is giving us. So the market is giving us information on the at-the-money swap-settled price, and it's giving information on the cash-settled payers. So these are the out-the-money options, and the cash-settled receivers. And now the question, but for example, we as a bank, we have swap-settled swaptions on our books in these areas, and we have cash-settled swaptions on our books in all areas here of both payer and receiver types. So we need to know what are the prices at those points. It's very relevant to us. And then the question is, how do we extend these graphs? Obviously not like this, but I mean that's what we want to do. So in this slide, I'm going to explain the ideas of the new model. And at the top of the slide, you see a valuation formula for cash-settled swaptions. So the value is the numeraire relative, the value today is the numeraire today multiplied by the expectation of difference of the swap rate and the strike, the positive part thereof, multiplied by the cash-settled PVP divided by the swap-settled PVP. And now, the thing is that the classic black swaption model never says anything about the PVP or how it is distributed in the future. So we still have some freedom remaining in our model, and we can use the freedom to specify a very specific process for the PVP. But we also want to keep it simple. So what we've done is we specified an auxiliary rate, which I denote by y star, which is similar to y, and it's also driven by the same Brownian motion. And then we set the swap-settled PVP equal to the cash-settled annuity formula, but evaluated with this auxiliary swap rate. And that gives us power to control the volatility of this swap-settled PVP compared to, for example, the volatility of the swap rate driving the payoff. And we want to make use of the same Brownian motion because that means that the formulas that we need to evaluate are one-dimensional integration. So we can easily do that using a quadrature routine. So here's an example with shifted log normal, but you can also apply this framework using the normal setup. So at the top you see a shifted geometric Brownian motion with its volatility sigma, and then the auxiliary process it's also a shifted geometric Brownian motion with its own volatility sigma star. And then the value of the cash settled is nothing more but, this repeating the formula of the previous slide. But what you get here is the cash settled annuity, cash settled annuity divided by the swap settled annuity. But the swap settled annuity is nothing more but the cash settled annuity evaluated with a different swap rate. This y we call the forecast swap rate, and the y star we refer to as the discount swap rate. Or also what we use terminology is that the y is the swap settled rate, and the y star is the cash settled rate. Put call parity no longer seems to work, but there is a different type of put call parity. It's when we consider a zero white collar. You've seen this term before. The zero white collar is where you go long a payer and short a receiver. You see the payoff at the top right corner there. And when you add up those two payoffs, what you get is you get something linear in the swap rate multiplied by the cash settled annuity. So this is, say, a cash settled swap. And now if you take two of those zero white collars at different strikes, and you go long one and short the other, then the linearity cancels out and you end up with something which depends only on the cash settled annuity and the difference between the strikes. So there must be a number which I call the convexity adjusted cash settled PVP, such that the value of such a zero white collar spread is this cache-settled convexity adjusted PVP times the difference in strikes. And also, we can simply work out, in our model, we can work out what the value is of this cache-settled convexity adjusted PVP. It's simply the expected value under our PVP measure of the cache-settled annuity. And so this formula is really useful, and it already gives us, takes us to one step into solving our puzzle, because once we calibrated the model at the money, we can calculate this number here, and then what we've got is, because what you saw, this is this graph again, but then zoomed in around the at the money. Here we have a receiver and a payer at the money are both known. Then if I go to a different strike, only one of the cash settled options value is known, but forming like a rectangle like this, the fourth one I can work out using this put-call parity relationship. That means that if I've calibrated my model at the money, then I can translate any cash-settled receiver to a cash-settled payer and vice versa. So that already creates, solves part of the puzzle. All I'm left with now is to work out what the swap-settled volatilities are, and to do so I've come up with this recipe. So remember, we're working with shifted log normal distribution. So the forecast shift I take is simply given by market data. So it's published, for example, by ICAP. The at the money swap settled volatility is also given by market data. And then for the at the money point, I can calibrate the discount volatility and the discount shift. Those are two unknown variables still that I still have in my model. I can calibrate it to the cash settled payer and the receiver. So these are two variables and two unknowns. So I should be able to hit that using a root finder. And this recipe is also available in Python code that we put on GitHub. And when you run this Python script, it will exactly go through this recipe. And for the calibration of this discount volatility and discount shift, it uses a root finder. So it's quite easy. Then, when we've done that for the at the money model, we can calculate the convexity adjusted cash settled PVP. And that gives us all our cash settled prices, both payer and receivers, for all strikes. And then what I do is I take the discount shift and keep it constant. So the discount shift I found at the money, I keep it constant. And then I'm left with only the swap settled volatility and the cash settled volatility for each model that I have for each strike. And I calibrate it to both cash settled swaptions. And that gives me the swap settled volatility. And then this is what I end up with. This is the result. And the gaps are complete again. We can use this model to value, say, banks' books of swaptions. And I was very pleased when I first saw this graph. And the interesting bit is as well that if you run the Python script, which is available on GitHub, then it will exactly produce this graph here. Okay, some references. So we put this paper on SSRN. Is it nearly time, Matteo? Yeah, the code has been put on GitHub. It's a Python script, and this is what we call reproducible research. So that means that anyone can just go there and generate these results themselves. there are some. This is more or less all of the literature that we could find on the topic. There are some catchy. There are some 2 papers with catchy names: cash settled swaptions, how wrong are we, and 2 colors and a free lunch. I didn't. Yeah, we didn't find them particularly. Well, yes. We did. Yeah, we weren't able to solve the problems that we faced using those 2 papers. We did get very far with the Berman and Williams paper, but they only cope with cash settled swaptions, so they don't allow to simultaneously model the swap settled swaptions. And there's also a paper by Mercurio from 2008 on cash settled swaptions and no arbitrage. And there's an interesting corollary in the paper as well, because what Mercurio says is that the market standard formula, so this fudge that I talked about for cash settled swaptions, is not arbitrage free, except for degenerate cases such as reduction to a caplet or zero volatility. And now, from the theory that we've developed in our paper, actually what we find, the following corollary, is that a multitude of arbitrage-free models exist in which both the swap-settled and the cash-settled market standard formulas hold. So that's kind of like a paradox. And the proof there is simply to use the discount forward swap rate equal to the forecast forward swap rate. And then the cash-settled PVP over the swap-settled PVP ratio exactly cancelled out, and you end up with the market standard formula for cash-settled swaptions again. So, yeah, this is a paradox. We think, I'm not sure what is causing this paradox. It might be, I think it has to do with the fact that Mercurio uses the terminal measure, whereas we use the swap-settled PVP measure. Yes. Also, I think what our paper finds is that the market standard formula for cash-settled swaptions, you shouldn't consider it to be a violation of arbitrage, but rather it's a poor modeling choice, because you don't allow separate distributions for the discounting and forecasting. So, conclusions. By modeling the annuity, we can additionally capture the valuation effects occurring for cash-settled swaptions while still being able to value swap-settled swaptions simultaneously. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. We still have 10 minutes that we can spend for a brief Q&A session, so please go ahead.
So thanks very much, and thanks for making the research available. Just ask you for a comment on the second paper you issued, the one 2 callers and a free lunch.
Yes.
Because you mentioned something, but yeah, you couldn't go far with that research. Just wondering what if you can go a bit more in the specific.
Yeah, Lutz does. I'm always confused between Henrar and Lutz, but I think Lutz, what he does is he uses an exponential terminal swap rate model.
Amongst, already, you know, but he then, I had the feeling that it doesn't go in the specific of what model to use, but it seems that they use a terminal swap rate model.
Yes. And I don't think I think we tried terminal swap rate models as well. I think with terminal swap rate, linear swap rate models, you always have this sort of like approximation, and this approximation seems to not help in this case as well. Also, the terminal swap rate model doesn't really change anything in terms of. What I also did was I looked at a full-fledged at the start while I was investigating the problem. I looked at a full-fledged interest rate model, the BGM model or LIBOR market model, and I found that I had little room to explain the gap, the zero white collar prices that we saw. And I was only able to capture that value when changing the volatility between the discounting and the forecasting, so that the discounting has a separate volatility compared to the forecasting. And I don't think that the Roots paper will do this for you. Yeah.
So in your assumptions, you assume essentially there is a Black-Scholes kind of model, of normal dynamics for the swap. And of course, this makes sense if you consider this kind of derivatives to be standalone, if you don't do any more exotics further reaching, for example, Bermudas. Do you think that this is actually what happens right now, that the market is not going any more further, so we don't need any more, much more exotic model, for example, kind of stochastic volatility in the framework? Do you think this is enough for some time, or?
Well, this specification is actually agnostic to the volatility small specification. In fact, you can combine it with, if you have a particular volatility small specification, you can combine this framework using that specification. So we use Sabre in particular, but you could use, what is it, stochastic volatility inspired, for example. And to answer your question is, do you think things will go this direction rather than more exotic? Yes, I think so. I think swaptions are already quite exotic nowadays, whereas they used to be maybe considered vanilla. I see it going that direction.
So this is kind of a multi-curve step will happen in ICAP for swaptions essentially, right?
Yes, yes, that is what this seems to be.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I'll ask you the last one, and then we'll have 5 minutes for changing rooms. This
before your last question.
No, I mean, we have
one
just
before.
one desk between the two of us, so
yes, sir.
please go ahead.
So,
2 desks nowadays.
2 desks.
You moved 1 desk.
Tomorrow.
yeah, thanks.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
His computer broke down completely. So.
Yeah. So many of these swaptions actually are on one curve still in the market traded. So only Euribor curve. They are not. They do not have different discounting and forecasting curves. So do I understand correctly that for the old single curve valuation of these swaptions, still these stories do not apply to those old LIBOR discounted swaptions? Is my question clear? So I see that still many of the swaptions you could trade them in the market, but based on the LIBOR discounted. They're not maybe OIS discounted. And because I understood from you said that it could be that because the forecasting and discounting curves have different volatilities, and maybe because of that we see different prices for the receivers swaptions and pair swaptions. But if I have a swaption that is on single curve framework, if it's all LIBOR discounted, can I conclude that the price of the receiver and the payer should be the same in the market, or still even for a single curve framework, still I see these differences in the market? Is it clear?
It's more clearer. There's a bit of I'm not sure with the quoting mechanics of swaptions. Are you familiar with that, Jelle?
Yeah, I think it's not correct what you say. So I don't think the market assumes LIBOR discounting for swaptions. Because otherwise you wouldn't see the difference between the payer and receiver swaptions quoted by.
Oh, they're OTC. I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, okay, but let's say the main broker is not quoting like that. So if I go to a broker and I want to buy the swaptions, I'm not getting the same price for a payer and receiver.
Okay.
Because there's a big spread. Or like the zero width color graph that the rule shows. That shows that banks are pricing the difference between payer and receiver swaptions for the long expiries, long underlying tenors. So I don't think that the main participants are using a single LIBOR model for price swaptions.
Okay.
Yes,
But if you assume that, then your remarks hold. But,
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I think is that these, for some reason, they traded these cash-settled swaptions, and they have a mathematical effect which was ignored by the market. But now that, this mathematical effects or the price of these cash-settled swaptions seem to be driven by, difference in volatility for the forecasting and the discounting. That seems to drive them, and then probably that has that has emerged recently in the market, that there is this true difference, and now people are starting to catch up, and they're using these new type of models to correctly value to value these options more concisely with what they see in the market. So what is going on, I suppose.
Yeah, I would add. And basically, there's a big discounting effect between your always discounting curve used in the swap-settled P2P computation and the much higher swap rates that are more dependent on the forwarding curve, resulting in quite different annuity computation for cash-settled swaptions. And that difference used to be smaller. So the effect was smaller than the bid-ask spreads. And now it's bigger.
Yeah. Yeah, because speaking of that, again, I couldn't exactly read the numbers, but it seemed to me that sometimes these offer to mid or